After 10 years of a rather rocky political road, a lot believe that it's time South Africans start to think differently. And why would they not, despite all the well-crafted and intended policies, our country still struggles to turn around economically, amongst other issues. Last year, Statistics South Africa reported that about 30.5 million South Africans are still officially living in abject poverty. So who should be in cabinet and in the presidency? What type of people? With what qualifications? It's an interesting conversation, it really is, and that's why we've decided to invite two guests to studio to talk to us about this. Firstly, we've got public policy analyst Kagiso Pooe, who likes me to call him TK rather, who wrote an article, and I quote, asserts that mediocrity in leadership became acceptable and to a lesser extent meddled with our belief that we are African, or we as Africans deserve visionary leadership. He also argues that we are no longer beholden to the imagery and historical legacy of liberation movements and now can imagine a future outside of them. Now, joining him, we've got Chris Madimecha, who is from the South African National Civic Organization, or SANCO. Gentlemen, great to have you in studio. Welcome.
Thank you, Leanne.
Yeah. TK, interesting article, and I mean, it's an article that I think a lot of South Africans have in their mind and are thinking about, you know, how are ministers chosen? Shouldn't it be on more a professional basis than anything else? But let's just get you to summarize it for us, for those that haven't read it.
Well, I was making the argument that if you look at our cabinet, firstly, there actually is no logic as to how you elect someone becomes a cabinet minister and a part of the executive. So my argument was to say, listen, if President Cyril Ramaphosa is really serious about changing things, we don't have to talk about what policies needs to be done. I think we've got enough. So the first port of call would be, let's actually cut cabinet down. Now, people just always mention numbers and terms, but they don't really get to the logic of how government works. So my article basically proposes that we actually need to get rid of deputies first and foremost.
Yeah.
Because if you actually look at the rate of deputies becoming ministers, it's actually null and void. It's actually not non-existent, you can say. So what's the point of having deputies? What you should rather have is actually have a system where not every department actually needs deputies. The larger ones, such as the Department of Trade and Industries, that needs deputies. But if the argument is we need to actually have people next in line, that's when you can say, wait, this department needs it. So I'm basically saying, let's actually discard the system, which actually has no logic. If you look at Chapter 5 of the South African Constitution, it just basically tells you how we elect a president, how we elect a cabinet. But it doesn't give you any qualifications or basically meritocracy as to what should happen. So I'm basically saying we actually have a chance to basically redesign the system anew. And there's international precedents. If you look at what's happening in Rwanda, if you look at what happens in China, if you look at what happens in Singapore, where you cannot have a minister without qualification. If I just want to give you a small little antidote, I was speaking to an advocate at Northwest University, Advocate Zaki. He was actually saying, in Uganda, you cannot actually play for the national side, the football side, without a matric.
Oh.
So that made me think, well, how does it work in South Africa? Then he told me, the only qualifications you need to be a South African member of parliament and by virtue of a minister is actually to be a South African citizen. So even issues such as a criminal record can actually be debated depending on what your crime was. So my argument says, if we really want to take South Africa forward after what I termed the lost decade, why don't we actually start saying, listen, do we actually need a deputy president? I say get rid of that. Put a prime minister in his place. What's a prime minister? Someone who actually just looks at issues of local government and how government should function. Make the presidency something ceremonial where you just talk about international relations. And that's basically the gist of my argument.
Interesting.
What I'm saying is it's not without precedence.
Yeah.
And we've got too many ministries at the moment which basically do nothing. And if you had to ask, give me one policy the government has really put in the last 10 years which we can actually say this was the objective and this is what happened, I'm very positive I can tell you nothing has really been done.
Yeah, I mean, this is an argument, I know, that the size of the cabinet we'll talk about as well. I mean, there's this old saying, basically, the best restaurant or restaurateurs, the best people who own restaurants are the ones that have started by cleaning the dishes, being a waiter, being the manager, being the chef, and then owning the restaurant. They have all the experience that's required to run a successful restaurant. And yet, when you take somebody into a position of a ministerial position, controlling a sector of mining that has zero experience in mining, one has to worry. And I understand what you're saying, because I think that kind of sums it up in the layman's terms. But I want to get, before we dig deeper into that, Sanko, what is your role in all of this, in the dispensation?
I think our role is very clear. Remember, us is to say whoever get into this ministerial post, as much as we spoke of qualification. What matters most, it will be the conduct of that particular people. What kind of people do we have then? What is it that they're doing? Being the voice of the voiceless, we expect to see people of this qualification, apart from being academic.
Yeah.
People who understand that where there's a conflict of interest, nothing will ever be achieved. People who understand that the receiving of these gifts do compromise the people's position in that particular position. People who understand deeply that they have to declare their financial interests so that at the end of the day, we don't have people who are very complicated in such a way that they compromise the service down to the people. Of course, it is our long argument to say people must have at least minimum qualification to acquire those positions. But one must understand where we are coming from. Of course, Lian, here where you are speaking of somebody who had no experience leading such department of some sort, we too, we share the very same sentence. But when are we going to train them? We are saying it's long overdue that we are in this democracy. People from now onwards, they can start be taken into training, the training that will produce quality leaders that will lead us without compromising the service itself.
Interesting perspective. And TK, let me come to you, because quite an essential angle is brought up, is that, you get intellectuals that have studied textbook-wise and they know their industries really, really well, but do they know the people? And let's bring mining magnates into this. I mean, we see the conditions that these miners live in, and their lives haven't been changed. But yes, you can create a successful mine, but what about the people that work for the mines? Who's looking after them? Let's get that sort of view from you.
All right, I think that's actually, it's quite a popular thing to say it, but it's actually a false dichotomy. In the sense that, if you look at it, it's been 2 decades, correct? I think an average degree takes you 3 years. And I've actually worked in the legislature where members of parliament are actually given the opportunity by the state to study for free in short courses. And when I say qualification, maybe I should give a definition.
Yeah.
The reason I use Rwanda, Paul Kagame does not have a degree. But what Paul Kagame has is experience from the military, from schooling, and how to lead. So when we say qualification, it also means what actually brings you to that portfolio. Now, if you look at where Rwanda is heading in terms of the economy, because I think that's what the central question was, Rwanda is actually on an upward turn. But what has Paul Kagame done differently? What he said is, listen, I'm not an economist. So he made sure his Minister of Finance is someone who is in economics. He said, look, I'm not great at infrastructure, so my Minister for Roads and Transport is someone who's qualified in that. So when we mean qualifications, the Chinese call it selection plus election. You come from the people, but the question is, you need to be the best and brightest from the people. And when I say it's a false dichotomy, in South Africa, the belief is, if you're smart, you must have a degree. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you're smart, clearly you should have come from a community where that beholdens you to be smart. I think it was Mshinini who said, listen, the point of education at the end of the day is that we take our people out of those situations. So a really good education, whether it's a PhD or a master's, even a first degree, simply says, I come from the people to go help the people. And I think in South Africa, that has been miscrewed as to say the only way you can come from the people is by banging your fist, saying popular slogans, and then when you come to the actual point of delivery, because a ministerial position is you're getting 1 million, I think it's 1.2 if I'm not mistaken, so after tax you're looking at 90 or 80. Now tell me, in what job do you get 1 million? And the only thing that you really are supposed to bring is, I understand the people. So that's what I'm saying, it's a false dichotomy. We cannot, that's why we're failing. And if you don't believe me, believe statistics. Who's the longest serving Director General in South Africa? Happens to come from the Ministry of Science and Technology. Why Science and Technology the best ministry throughout the last 10, 20 decades? Well, it began with the Zapo Dr. Mabut Musabudi, I think, from the Azanian People's Organization. Thabo Mbeki said, please go fix that. What did he have different? He was a doctor in his specific field. And that's why the ministry has been able to go on. And the mistake they make is, you're not just bringing a minister. A minister brings a chief of staff. A chief of staff actually can contest many of the decisions civil servants make. We always ask what a DG should have at least 5 years or 10 years or 17 years experience. If I looked at the most recent one for arts and culture, you must be a specialist in that field. So if we can ask a DG to have all those qualifications, but you bring a minister who basically might have their own agenda, brings in their own staff, that basically cripples the whole department, And the only thing we're asking for them is you need to come from the people. That's what I mean. It's a false dichotomy. Are you good enough or not? And
we've got great examples of that, and we'll give them. Let's take a very quick break, and I really want to get Sanko's feedback on this, because this is it's a great conversation to be having, and we'd love to hear from you, because this affects you and I directly. And I know that South Africa, you have an opinion on this particular conversation. At Morning Live SABC, we really want you to tweet us and send us your views, and perhaps post some questions as well. See you after the break.